When credibility begins to slip, most politicians try to regroup. They recalibrate messaging. They soften tone. They pivot. Trump does something else. He performs. He builds bigger stages, louder moments. Glossy events designed to dominate headlines long enough to bury uncomfortable questions. When pressure rises, spectacle rises with it. It's a strategy he understands instinctively. If you can't erase scrutiny, overwhelm it. A clear example is the so-called Board of Peace event, framed as a sweeping global initiative, marketed with language that suggests it stands above traditional institutions like the United Nations. That's familiar Trump branding. Give it a grand title, declare it historic, package it as world-shifting. And trust that the scale of the announcement distracts from the details, but legitimacy isn't created by proclamation. It isn't born from a press release. Real international credibility comes from participation, from allies committing resources, from institutions recognizing authority. It comes from whether the world sees you as stabilizing, not destabilizing. You can build a stage, you can brand an event, but you can't manufacture consensus by decree, and that's where the contrast grows sharper. Because at the same time Trump amplifies spectacle, his credibility is absorbing pressure from multiple directions. One of those pressures involves renewed public attention around Jeffrey Epstein-related transparency. Not because every name mentioned in documents automatically equals guilt. It doesn't. But because people are reacting to something deeper, the appearance of selective transparency. For years, Trump's political movement energized its base around the demand to release the files. It framed disclosure as a moral imperative. Transparency was cast as righteous. Accountability was framed as cleansing. But when scrutiny inches closer to Trump's orbit, the tone shifts. Suddenly it's old news. Suddenly it's irrelevant. Suddenly it's a witch hunt. That pivot is not subtle. And contradictions like that don't simply create controversy. They erode credibility. Because credibility depends on consistency. If transparency is sacred when it harms opponents, but optional when it threatens allies, the moral argument collapses. And the public can sense the difference. The tension intensifies when you zoom out internationally. In countries with long histories of entrenched power, public investigations into high-profile figures connected to scandal continue to unfold. The message those societies send isn't that they're flawless. It's something simpler. Scrutiny is not treason. Accountability is not sabotage. Questions are not acts of war. That principle is destabilizing for Trump's political framework because his survival strategy depends on reframing scrutiny as persecution. Investigations become attacks. Criticism becomes conspiracy. Institutional checks become weaponization. The narrative only works if voters accept the equation. Accountability equals political revenge. But the moment that equation fails, the moment voters distinguish between scrutiny and persecution, the protective shield weakens. Because if oversight is legitimate, then immunity is not, and that is the central tension. Trump's political model thrives on converting legal pressure into emotional solidarity. Every investigation becomes proof that he is fighting for you. Every court proceeding becomes evidence of establishment fear. It transforms accountability into validation. But that alchemy has limits. It depends on repetition. It depends on loyalty. And it depends on public fatigue with complexity. If voters begin to evaluate each situation independently, asking whether transparency should apply evenly, the narrative grows brittle. The spectacle becomes harder to maintain, and spectacle, while powerful, cannot permanently substitute for legitimacy. Legitimacy requires something quieter and harder to fake: trust. Trust that institutions are acting in good faith. Trust that rules apply broadly. Trust that powerful figures are not shielded by status alone. When that trust weakens, leaders often lean more heavily on performance because performance is controllable. You can script an event, you can curate attendees, you can choreograph applause. You cannot choreograph credibility, and that is the crossroads embedded in this moment. If voters continue to equate scrutiny with persecution, the immunity narrative survives. But if voters begin to separate accountability from vendetta, the political foundation shifts. Because a movement built on exceptional treatment cannot coexist easily with a culture that expects equal treatment. Once citizens accept that powerful figures should answer questions like anyone else, the aura of untouchability fades. And without that aura, spectacle feels thinner. The immunity fantasy depends on convincing Americans that any attempt to scrutinize is corrupt. The moment that belief erodes, the architecture weakens. The stage lights still shine, the branding still dazzles. But underneath, the emotional insulation thins. And once the insulation thins, accountability stops feeling like persecution. It starts feeling like process. The moment people decide to look anyway, the immunity fantasy begins to crack.